enter a new life after redevelopment. It's official. It is a new life for all of us, and we need to respond to a lot of needs, and also folks have a lot of questions. So we think that today's panel will be a formidable panel that will give us a lot of insight in terms of what happens now. What are the next steps after redevelopment has been eliminated, and we have all these obligations that cities and local agencies have assumed. How do they move forward? And how do we stay engaged in this conversation? So with that, I want to make sure that we give a warm welcome to our panelists. We have Kathleen Rosenow, who is the principal of RSG, Inc., a founding principal with over 36 years experience in community and economic development. Ms. Rosenow is a recognized expert in redevelopment, specializing in redevelopment project area formation, plan implementation, bond financing, affordable housing, commercial revitalization, and economic development. Ms. Rosenow has directed the creation or amendments of over 75 redevelopment project areas throughout California, provided fiscal consulting services in support of over $1 billion in tax increment bonds, consulted on redevelopment implementation projects, including solicitation of developers, prepared financial performance analyses, structured financial terms and negotiated disposition and development agreements, and structured and monitor tax increment pass-through agreements, and also verify increment calculations, and directed community outreach programs and education forums. Our next panelist is Jennifer LeSar, president of LeSar Development Consultants. Jennifer LeSar has more than 25 years experience in real estate development and investment banking industry, and brings a diverse background to her firm's work in redevelopment, affordable housing, community development, urban revitalization. Ms. LeSar has developed or financed over $3 billion in residential and commercial properties. Her technical expertise span from policy and program development to comprehensive strategic planning for top executives and executive teams to financial restructuring and investment analysis. She also served as a board member of the San Diego City Center Development Corporation for 8 years, 1 term as chair and 2 terms as treasurer. With that, welcome our panel.
Thank you. Good to see you all. A few familiar faces, but lots of new faces, and pleasure to be here with you today. As Cesar has pointed out, it is a new day in California. Some of us are rather sad about it, and there are lots of people who are very glad about it. But the decision's made, and now it's time to live with it. What we're going to try to do is quickly get through a PowerPoint presentation to kind of cover a broad range of the issues, and then have hopefully lots of time for questions and answers. So starting with the reality of AB 1X26, I think we'll call it 26 from here on. First off, it dissolved all redevelopment agencies as of February 1st. I don't know what you did yesterday, but we had a rest in peace party at our office. It creates successor agencies for every redevelopment agency in the state. It transfers affordable housing functions and some assets to an alternate form of successor to housing. And it also creates an oversight board, and we're going to talk briefly about each of those. Starting with successor agencies. Typically, the sponsoring community that created the redevelopment project area, be it a city or a county, has taken the responsibility for being the successor agency. The successor agencies will be monitored by an oversight board and also by the California Department of Finance. So everything that they do is subject to the approval of others. The key responsibility of the successor agency is to pay ongoing enforceable obligations to those of us in the industry, EOPS, IROPS. It's all a bunch of new acronyms, but the important part here is that the law defined what prior obligations of a redevelopment agency were enforceable. It requires that the successor agency establish an administrative budget, and the duty of the successor agency is to unwind all the activities of an agency and to liquidate its assets. The purpose of that is to move the proceeds from those assets and future property tax that's not needed to pay enforceable obligations, to move all of that back to affected taxing entities. Now, there was a provision that if the sponsoring community did not choose to be the successor agency, another taxing entity within that county could elect to take that, or the governor was put in the role of naming who the successor agencies would be. It's our understanding that within the county of Orange, all cities or the county has determined to be their own successor agency. There are 4 statewide who chose not to, the largest one being LACRA. You probably read about that in the paper. The Oversight Committee now is a separate board. So you have the successor agency, which is essentially the former redevelopment agency, city council. And now you have a separate board called the Oversight Committee. And the duty of the Oversight Committee is to supervise the successor agency activities. So there are 7 members to that Oversight Committee. Just real quickly, 2 are named by the Board of Supervisors of the county. 1 is named by the mayor of the city. 1 is named by the county superintendent of education. 1 is named by the chancellor of the California Community Colleges, and another is named by the largest special district within the county that also has presence in the project area. And then lastly, the mayor or the board of supervisors is to name a former RDA employee, and typically that employee is to be representative of the largest union that was present amongst the former redevelopment agency employees. The housing successor, not to be confused with the successor agency. It's a separate entity. And the sponsoring city can select to be what we're calling the housing successor, or a local housing authority can be named to take on that responsibility. And if neither of those are present, then the state HCD takes on the role as the housing successor. What happens with the housing successor is they are allowed to retain housing assets, except for existing fund balances, which may be changed with the potential passage of SB 654. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the successor agency can retain assets. Now, assets is not very well defined in the code. So there's lots of discussion going on right now as to what exactly that means. The housing successor, when they take those assets, also has the responsibility for assuming the former redevelopment functions pertaining to affordable housing. Again, not very well defined in the code as to what exactly taking on those functions means. Reminder, most importantly, is that the housing successor is not subject to the oversight of the oversight board. So they are an independent group who has some assets, not quite sure of exactly what, has some responsibilities, not quite sure of exactly what, and they are free to operate independently of the Oversight Board. Also, a few other players involved pursuant to the legislation. First, the county auditor controller. The legislation gives the county auditors the responsibility to perform audits of every redevelopment agency. And these audits are to be completed by the 1st of July. They're also responsible for certifying the accuracy of the recognized obligation payment schedule. There is a bit of a timing problem with this because the audits aren't to be done until July, but the ROPs are supposed to be approved in mid-April. So we're waiting to figure out what exactly the auditor controller's role will be. The auditor controller is then also responsible for the administration of all future property taxes, what used to be tax increment and going to the redevelopment agency. They are to pay some of that out back to the successor agency in order for that successor agency to pay their debt. And then they are to pay old, what we call pass-through payments to other affected taxing entities. And then anything that's left over gets distributed according to tax rate area and each taxing entity's share of those property taxes. The state controller also plays a role. They have some oversight capacity, and for starters, they have to determine if there were any asset transfers that occurred after January 1st, 2011 that violate the provisions of AB 26. Even though the legislation was adopted mid-2011, it made provision that agencies, any transactions, any asset movement was violating 26. And so that is going to be a huge undertaking for the state controller to get their handle on what transactions occurred and whether they are appropriate under 26 or not. The Department of Finance also plays a significant role. They have the power to review actions of the Oversight Board, and Oversight Board actions actually do not become effective until they are approved by DOF. So the State Department of Finance is a huge player in how this will play out. In my opinion, they've also become somewhat the self-anointed interpreter of AB 26. Many practitioners and attorneys are questioning the accuracy of some of the advice that they are giving, but they do see themselves in the role as being in charge. Lastly, state HCD, we mentioned this earlier, but they do have a role if the housing successor is not named locally. They are responsible for taking over those assets and the functions of the former housing portion of the redevelopment agency. So I'm going to pause there, and Jennifer will take over with the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Kathy started off by sharing that many people in the state are quite sad about the ending of redevelopment. There are those that are happy about it. But I'd say whether you're sad or happy, there are some pretty universal feelings about it right now, which are confusion, anxiety, and an intellectual curiosity about and a hope about what might be ahead as we move into the post-redevelopment era. And I'm going to touch on those in a few minutes. I'm going to start with some of the challenges that have already been experienced because of the ending of redevelopment and some that are ahead of us. Starting with the housing successor agency, for those of you in city government or in independent agencies now handling this function, it's unclear what the funding is for ongoing operations. And if you're a small city where you had city staff, maybe doing a redevelopment function, and you know that portfolio really well, there are some issues about how you may support your staff, but this is a huge issue for agencies that are having to absorb a portfolio that they didn't handle, like in San Diego where we have 3 redevelopment agencies. In Los Angeles, the most extreme example where the housing department is inheriting the redevelopment agency portfolio. There's a thought that successor agencies may choose to share some of the administrative budget with the housing successor. But I think more likely there's going to have to be an analysis of the sort of the benefits and the burdens of the portfolio. You're going to have to hope you came out with a portfolio that you can optimize to at least cover your staffing costs. There's uncertainty about the use of the unencumbered housing bond proceeds. We'll hope that we get some clarity on that going forward. And it's unclear if the redevelopment law obligations for replacement housing and inclusionary housing will continue. For those of you who know about the Western Center for Law and Poverty letter, it gets to this issue. And lastly, there's uncertainty about the use of loan repayment funds. Other issues that have come up, and this is one where there's been a lot of anxiety, is will there be bond defaults? And it's really a two-part issue. For some cities, there's a question if there's enough money to cover the bond payments. There's also a concern that's talked about a lot, which is that the bond payments, which are paid twice a year, are in different amounts. And so we want to make sure both that in the ROPS accounts for the spring payment and the fall payment, and so the fall payment, we're assured that the funding is there. And that will probably have to go in the first 6-month ROPS. And secondly, we're again hoping for some cleanup legislation that might address this issue. To date, there have been title insurance challenges as developers have tried to close their loans. It's possible that this will get better now that we are in the post-redevelopment era, but there's been anxiety about what the name of the agencies will be, and who will sign the loan documents, and what name those loan documents should have on them. Within the dialogue around the bond markets, you may have seen that Moody's, Fitch, and S&P all downgraded or threatened to downgrade debt. If you go into the nuances of that was very much a wait and see message. We're concerned, but we're going to wait and see. On Tuesday, the Wall Street Journal wrote an article called "Buyers Are Jumping into Debt of California Redevelopment Offices." The debt markets for redevelopment bonds have actually now returned to their current levels, and there's speculation that this is now actually a precious commodity, and the pricing on the purchase of these bonds will go up. So again, a lot of messages out there, very different perspectives being shared. I'm going to talk briefly about the significant dates. Obviously, yesterday was the first day that redevelopment agencies no longer existed, and successor agencies were supposed to assume the assets. The cooperation agreements are void that the sponsoring communities executed. And now only enforceable obligations are payable, things that are on the EOPS, for you guys still trying to get the language, EOPS and ROPS, key language. On March 1st, the successor agencies are to have prepared their ROPS. It goes to the state controller and the Department of Finance on April 15th. But you might ask, well, when is the oversight committee going to get it? Because they have to approve it also, and oversight committees don't have to be created until May 1st. But I think that what we'll see is that they'll be created as soon as people can get them up and running for the purpose of being able to approve the ROPS and having a smooth transaction of business. Also on May 15th, if the oversight boards are not filled, all those seats aren't filled, the governor will appoint members to those committees, to those boards. On May 1st, after May 1st, only things on the ROPS can be paid, so not things on the EOPS. That's sort of the temporary list. And also by May 1st, the Oversight Board has to appoint their chair and report that to the Department of Finance. By July 1st, the county auditor controllers are to complete their audits. Been nice if we had thought that all this is happening in the middle of tax season. So it's going to be very challenging when outside audit firms are to be engaged to do this work, and I think there's concern and some recognition that this may slip. By July 15th, those audits go to the state controller, and this is really an outside date, but by January 1st of 2013, the cleanup legislation has to be drafted. I think we'll see the cleanup legislation come out very soon, maybe as early as I want to talk to you about the status of the policy initiatives that you've probably been following, and then where we might go as the next iteration of community development and affordable housing tools. SB 659 was Senator Alex Padilla's bill that sought to postpone dilution of the redevelopment agencies. That failed last week, and that's why we are where we are today. There was widespread belief and firm messaging from the governor's office that he would have vetoed that bill. He definitely wanted to see redevelopment end so we could get started on this process of dissolution. Senator Steinberg's bill was approved by the Senate on Tuesday, 34-1, not as an urgency bill, but as a budget trailer bill. That bill is now in the Assembly, and because it's a budget trailer bill, when it's approved by the Assembly, and provided I think it's not approved, vetoed by the governor, it can go into effect immediately. This is a very significant bill for our industry because it retains the balances in the low and moderate income fund accounts. So that's about $1 billion. It's a little over $1 billion that we retain for affordable housing in California. Hopefully will serve as a buffer for the industry for the next year as we try and move forward working on other things. Some of the significant components of that bill are, first and most significantly, that the funding is retained. Second, that county housing authorities now can actually reject becoming housing successors. That was just sort of a vagueness. And then housing successor agencies, before the legislation says they may enforce the affordable covenants, now they shall enforce those covenants. There is some legislation that has not been introduced, but it's been drafted, called the Housing Opportunity Trust Fund Act of 2012. I'd say this is really what we talk about, as the permanent source legislation. It right now is based on using a document recording fee of $75. It's sponsored by Senator Mark Desaulniers. And I think it's mostly significant for its advocacy and education purposes and keeping the idea of the permanent trust fund alive, but we don't think that it will have support. We don't think it can survive the realtors at this point, but it may go through, you may start to see it move through the committee process. And I did want to talk just about the RDA cleanup legislation. Again, I think we hope to see the cleanup legislation coming out in the next few weeks, and that will be very helpful. And it'll also be, I think, comforting that we have more certainty on some of these things that have been very poorly drafted in 26. And the future of funding platforms. Actually Friday, Claudia Capio is speaking at UCLA, and she is pledged to talk about the permanent source. So the Housing Opportunity Trust Fund Act of 2012, is a piece of legislation drafted, but Claudia is really leading that from a policy standpoint at the state. I think many of you know that HCD and CalHFA we're in the budget to be merged. That should be going into effect on July 1st. So we'll look to our senior housing leaders to continue that dialogue around the permanent source. So she'll be doing that from the agency perspective. The legislature is doing it starting on the Senate side. So besides the permanent trust fund, there are three other ideas or platforms that are being talked about where we might house or use these as vehicles to continue the tools of redevelopment. And when I talk about that, I really mean not just affordable housing, but community economic development as well. The first are infrastructure financing districts. They've actually been around for quite a while, but they have a 2/3 vote to implement them. There's only been one IFD implemented in the state, and it's in Carlsbad, and it was used to create Legoland. But what they are is they're a vehicle created by cities and counties for community scale public works such as highways, transit, water systems, sewer projects, flood control, childcare, libraries, parks, etc. And it, again, like redevelopment, it's a diversion of property tax increment that is used within that district. Right now there are 4 different bills that were in the last legislative session. They didn't go forward, but they all addressed trying to make the 2/3 voter approval mandate down to 50%. Some of them have it at 50% just for the affordable housing piece, but they're focused both on affordable housing and community development. So you probably will begin to hear more and more about exploring how to make those more workable at the local level. The second sort of area of discussion, and there's a lot of talk that redevelopment should really look like a tool for the 21st century. So it should talk about sustainable development, transit-oriented development, still the cleanup of brownfields, affordable housing, and the Strategic Growth Council, which is responsible for the implementation of SB 375 and AB 32, already exists. Its members are cabinet heads and agency directors, and a few other slots. It's required by law to manage and award grants and loans to support the planning and development of sustainable communities. So that may be a statewide funding vehicle if we have both a local solution for redevelopment and a state solution, where you have local tools and state tools. And then lastly, the Air Resources Board and cap and trade funds, you're seeing more discussion of this. There was an article in the LA Times yesterday where the governor is looking to use these proceeds potentially for the high-speed rail project. I just want to read just a few things about this. So in his budget this year, he included a reference to sustainable infrastructure development funds to reduce emissions through strategic planning and development of major infrastructure, including transportation and housing. So this is these funds are predicted to be about $1 billion a year, but we won't know the amounts, and we won't have sort of vehicles for discussion until 2013. But again, this is another potential tool. $1 billion is a lot of money. There are many, many steps to go and many fights to fight before how these funds will get used will be determined. But Permanent Trust Fund, IFD, Strategic Growth Council, cap and trade, sort of 4 different vehicles or realms of discussion at least present already here on February 2nd. And I think with that, Kathy and I are going to answer any questions you have.